Hi everyone, thanks for joining. I just want to give it a couple more moments just to see if we can get a couple more people to attend, but I'll start shortly. Well, everyone, thanks for joining today's webinar where we're looking at doing imports where you're linking and updating records at the same time. Now, I'm sure you know by now, my name is Milo and I'm part of the support team. And today I'll be talking to you about importing data into workbooks where you can link and update records at the same time. We're most of the way through this year's drop-in webinars, which are every other Wednesday at 4 p.m. You can see the next two that we have planned, and there will be more to come next year. We also do run a 2-day training course for system admins and reportings where we do go into our topics a lot more in depth. And if you do want information about these courses, you can contact your account manager or email training@workbooks.com. But let's get into why we're here today. So first, I'm going to remind you what can be done when importing data into workbooks. As we will be building on what was covered in our last webinar, I'll talk you through a possible scenario where you would need to import data, show you the data that I'll be using, and then going into workbooks to show you how to do everything. If you watched our last webinar, you may remember what I said that you can do when importing data. One of the key things is that you can create new records. Creating new records that via import saves you time and helps reduce potential human error, especially if you've got hundreds of people that need to be added to your database. Of course, if there are any errors within the file, these would reflect within your import. Now, also when doing an import, you can link data to existing records. An example of this could be that you're importing new people and want to link these to organizations currently in your database. Bear with me 2 moments. What else you can do is you can also extend your import to more than one record type. Now, an example of this could be that you're doing an import where you're wanting to create new cases, but you also want to create new activities at the same time. And you can also update fields on existing records. Now, this is useful because you may want to tidy up some of the data that you have. To do this, you can export your data, clean it up in a CSV file, and then import it back into workbooks, overwriting the existing information. You can also choose whether you want to just update existing records, or you can create new records, or you could do both at the same time. So you can update them, and if no record exists, then a new one would be created. Now, when you are putting together your data for the import, you will need to have it saved as a CSV file. So today, I'm going to be focusing on linking your data and extending it to another record. I've got a list of people and the organizations they work for. First, I'll go through importing the organizations. This means that when I'm importing my people, I'll be able to link them to those organizations. And then while I'm importing my people, I will also extend my import. So I'll also be creating campaign memberships. Now, before we start, there are a few things we need to consider. First, think about where you're wanting to see your data from your file within Workbooks. What record are you importing to? And do you have the fields on those records for the data? The import wizard, which I'll be showing you later, allows you to select which column in your file maps to which field within Workbooks. Remember that on your records, you do have mandatory fields. So when you're creating a new record, make sure that you have this information in your file so that it can be mapped in. And some fields do have a certain format. So for example, you could be importing currency values, dates, or email addresses. You'll need to make sure that you have these in the correct format. If you're unsure about the mandatory fields or what format the data needs to be in, I'd suggest visiting our knowledge base either by searching preparing your import data or typing in the link that you guys can see on the screen. So let's have a look at what we've been asked and the task that I'll be showing you today. So the marketing team has given me a file with a list of people and their employers and want to add them to a campaign that they'll be doing called London Trade Show. They also want to have the people to have a campaign status, a membership status of interested. So I'm not sure if these people already exist in the database, but I've asked that if they do exist, that I update the information with the information that I've got on the file. So it seems fairly straightforward. So let's have a look at the file that I've been given. So on the screen, you can see that I've got a list of people, where they work, and various other bits of information on here, such as job titles. But when we take a closer look at the data, we can see that there are a couple of errors here. One of the first things that I can see is that for Abigail Adams, we actually have her twice within the data. Something else that I can see is for this entry of Atlantic Computer Services, there's actually a spelling error in computer, but I can see that that organization is there again, and it does have the correct spelling. Now, normally I would go in, I would clean this up and correct the obvious errors, but for this example today, I'm not going to, as I want to show you what happens when you do it. So as I've got the data, the first thing that I would need to do is import my organizations so that I have them within the database. Now, to save a bit of time, I have done the import already, but I want to show you the steps that I went through and how I mapped them all out so that you can see the end result. So let me jump into Workbooks and show you. So on our last webinar, I showed you that there are the different ways in how you can start an import. One way is that if you go to the Start menu and select the record type you want, that on the left here, you do have the option to import that record type. But that's not the way that I'm going to be doing it today. The other way to do it is when I go to the Start menu, I've got my bulk changes, and I've got the option for import. And this will show me any imports that I've previously done. And on the left here, you can see that we've got the records that we can import for. So let's start with the organizations. So I'm going to scroll down and select organizations, and we get our import wizard. Now, I did go through all of the options that you do have here, but the main things that I want to point out is if you have previously done an import and you're repeating it, you do have the option to select the mappings from a previous import, and you can select which import that was. But I'm going to start from scratch. So to add my file, where we've got CSV file, if I go browse, this will open up and I can select my file. So with it selected, I'll go to next. I can then see how many columns and rows that I have, but I'll also just go to next so I can get to the mappings. So here I am for the mappings for my organizations. And as you can see on the right, we have our fields and workbooks, and on the left, the fields from our file. Now, one thing that hasn't been mapped is the organization name, and we can see that it's mandatory because it's got a star next to it. So let me select that and map to it. So from here, I'll select my employer field and go save and close. And the other mapping that I'm going to do here is I'm going to map the street address. Now you can see on the left that I've got two columns that have street address, and I'm going to concatenate both of them. So if I click on street address on the right, look at my mapping type and change that so that I can concatenate fields from source file. I can put in a field separator where I'm going to select new line, and then I can add the rows from the data. So if I go street address 1 and street address 2, and I can save and close that. So that's my mappings done for the organization. So here I can go to next. And for stage 4, for my import mode, you can see it's selected as only create new records. Well, since I know that there are a couple of records that are, or that there are a couple of organizations in there multiple times, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select update existing records and create new ones. So with that selected, I now need to say, what does Workbooks want to use to identify if there is a duplicate? In my data, I had got the external reference field mapped, which would be unique to each organization. So I'm going to use that as my identifier. So with that selected, and I go next. And usually at this point, I would run my import. But to save time, as I said, I've already done the import. So let me just bring that up so I can show you the results of what happened. So in my summary, I can see that for the total records created, it's done 5, but it's also updated 3. So when I go to my affected records, it gives me a list of what's happened. So as you can see that it's created some, it's then updated one of them, it's created another, and it's updated. So I can actually track what has happened. But I can also see that I've got a couple of errors here. When I go to my errors, it's saying that one organization couldn't be created. And in my rejected data, when I look through it, it shows me the row from my file that was rejected. And it was rejected because for the employer, that while it has an external reference, it doesn't have an employer name. So it couldn't create anything. But that's the import for my organizations. So I would approve this, and then I would start my import for people. So again, on the landing page for imports, I'd go down and I would select people. And again, I would need to select the file that I want to use. And I'm going to go through to stage 3, just so we can start to look at the mappings for this. So you can see that I do have mappings already in here, but not all of them are correct. The first one that I can see is for the employer column in my source data, it's mapped to the claimed employer, which isn't correct, as we know. So I'm actually going to remove that mapping, and we can look into adding it again. I've also got the external reference mapped. Well, I won't need this for the person record as I needed it for the organization. So I'm going to take that one out as well. So now I need to add the mappings that I want. So first, when I go to the employer, you can see that next to it, it has a triangle. Now this triangle indicates that it's drilling through to another record. And you can see here that we now have this section called linking rule, which we didn't previously have. Now the linking rule is saying, okay, so what field on that record should I match for? Now, if I picked organization name, well, I do know that there's a spelling error in one of those. So what I'm going to do is, because I've got that unique external reference, I'm going to select that one. And in my source data for the file field, I'm also going to select external reference. So I'll save and close that. Now I can also see that my email address has not been mapped. So let me add that one. So just do that. So save and close. And finally, for the address, again, I've got the street address. So I'm going to quickly add that as well, which I'm doing that in the same way that I did it for the organizations. So let me quickly add these. Now, those are all the fields that I want populated on a person record. But as part of what I'd been asked, they also want all of these people to be added to a campaign and have a member status of interested. So in order to do this, I'm going to have to use the option that you can see here on the right called extend, where if I click on this, I've got an option here of campaign membership. So when I click that, you can now see that I've got campaign membership down at the bottom on the right. If I minimize the person fields, I can then see all the fields for the campaign membership. So let's start with actually mapping it. Now, I'm going to select the campaign status because while it is also mandatory, it does also have the triangle. So when I click this, you can see that for my linking rule, it's already come up with two fields to match on, the status of the campaign. Now, for the campaign, I know that I've got the name within my file. So for the file field, I can go in here and select campaign name. But for the status, I don't have a field within there. So I'm going to go with the option to put a default or constant value. And I'm going to put that as interested. So with that mapping done, I'm going to save and close this. And while you can see that the campaign membership status is still showing as mandatory, because I've got the membership status within that mapping that I did, it will still map there. So with this done, let me go next. And for stage 4, again, I'd need to select my import mode. And for this, again, I will select update existing records and create new ones. Now, for my unique identifiers, it has already selected employer. Now, because I've got some rows within my data where they have the same employer, I don't want to solely match on that. So what I'm going to do is actually add a second identifier of email address. Now, it's important to remember that if you've selected more than one identifier, when Workbooks is looking at the records, it will say if they match on both, not just one or the other. So if I have two identifiers, they would both need to match in order to be marked as already existing. So with that done, I would go to next. And when I go to the summary, I would have the option of run. But let's have a look at the import that I did previously so you guys can see the results and you can see what happened. So here I have the import I previously did, where I can see that a total of 14 records were created, where 7 were campaign memberships and 7 were people. And in my affected records, we can see a list of what had been created. One thing you probably notice at this point is I've got 2 person records for Abigail Adams. Now, the reason why I have 2 is because I said that I wanted to identify using both the employer and the email address. But for one of the Abigail Adams rows, they didn't have an email address, so it didn't match. So that's why only one record has been, why 2 records have been created. Now in my errors, I can see that I've got 2 failed where it's saying that the email address wasn't valid. And when I go to my rejected data, again, I can see the 2 rows that I had there, and looking at those email addresses, I can see one has a space in it and the other one isn't an email address. Something else that's worth pointing out is I do have 2 warnings here. And looking at these warnings, what I can see is one is saying that it's got a bad value of South Sudan for country for the person. Now, knowing this database, I know that the country field is a pick list that has a list of all countries. And this is telling me that South Sudan isn't on that pick list. What I would usually do in this situation is confirm, make sure South Sudan is correct for my data. And if it is, I'd make sure that it's added to the pick list so that I can get that updated. Now, the other warning that I've got is saying that it couldn't find an employer with the external reference ABC666. And that's because going to my rejected data, we can see that Sunny, who had that external reference, didn't have the employer. And if you remember, we didn't have an organization record created from there. Now, that's my import done. And obviously at this point, I do have the choice to approve or reject. Now, in this situation, as I only have a couple of errors, what I would probably do is I would still approve this import, and then I would go back and either do a new one to create those 2 records that hadn't been and remove the duplicate manually, or if my data was a lot larger and I had a lot more rejected data, I would probably reject this import, go into my file, clean it up again, and redo the import using the same mapping. Now, what you would do in your situation depends on what has happened. But that's it. We've created organization records from an import and updated some of them at the same time. And we've also imported people, linked them to a campaign, and given them a membership status. So let's recap on everything. So when you're doing the imports, you'd notice that I did this in the order of organizations first and then people. It's good to think about which order you want to do your imports. Something else to always remember is to try and use unique identifiers where possible. These can be used to help identify duplicate records. And while in this example, I used an external reference, if you have an object reference in your data, that can also be used as a unique identifier. Now, it's always important to review your data before and after performing the import. That way you can see if there are any errors, and you're also able to see if anything hasn't been imported correctly. And then finally, once you've done your import, it's always important to either approve or reject it so that it just confirms that the import has happened, or it can remove those records that you've created at the same time. So let's see if we've got any questions. So I've got a question here that's come up of, could I have imported organizations, people, and linked to a marketing campaign all in the same import, or did I need to do it separately? While it is possible to do the import at the same time, I would always recommend to do it separately, so that in the way that I've done it, so that I've imported the organizations first. That way you can also make sure that you've got the base data first before linking it to the records that you want. And so I've got a question here from Tomislav. Is there a possibility to upload just a mailing list without creating additional records in Workbooks? So Tomislav, I believe for that you're asking, can you create a mailing list via an import? I mean, certainly that is, I believe it can be done. So let me just jump into Workbooks to check this. So Tomislav, there is the option to import a mailing list. So it is possible to do that, where again, you would be able, if you've got the details of the people, you would be able to import it that way. And let's see. So I've got another question here. What records can you join together in imports? So that's a very good question. So let me just go back to that import that I was doing previously for people and go back a couple of stages to where I got to my mappings. So for here, for the unmapped workbooks fields where I've got my extend, you can see that we do have a list of different records type that we've got on here. So you do have, I did campaign memberships. You've also got activities. You can link them to, it says employer, so it means an organization. And you can also map to relationships between the people and other records. And this could be a relationship similar to a person to person, or as you can see here, you've also got employer relationships. So you can see that there are different options there. So let's see, I've got another one from Kim. Can I show you how to import payments? I'm I'm I would say, Kim, do you mean to simply update, or are you meaning to actually see that a payment has been taken so that you can mark it on, say, a contract or an invoice? And also, what record would you be wanting to mark the payment against? Uh, Payment has been made for an invoice that has been raised in workbooks. I'd say, Kim, with this one, I'll probably reach out to you after the webinar just so that we can go through a few more details and actually look into that one together for that one. And So follow-up question from Tomislav. Does the system need to create additional records like a person record or lead record when you just want to upload a file with email addresses? Well, one thing that you can actually do when doing the import for people is there is the option there of mailing list membership. So you can do an import not just to create records, but if you were to simply go, yes, I want to just update them, you're not having to create them, and you can add them to that mailing list. But in short, yes. And I've got a question here from Hanan. How do you import to a multi-select field? So Hanan, if you're wanting to import to a multi-select pick list, within your source data, you would simply have all the values that you want, and you'd have a comma between each one, just so it can show that there are the different values within there. Obviously, all of those values in your file would also need to show in the pick list that you're using. And just seeing if there are any more questions. Doesn't seem to be. So I have to say, thank you guys. Our next webinar will be on the 28th of October where we'll be going into bulk actions, covering how you can update, assign, and create records all in one go. But in the meantime, if you do need any help, you can always press the question mark icon within Workbooks, where that would also take you to the knowledge base, or you can simply go to it using the URL as you can see on the screen. Alternatively, if you are an authorized support contact, you can reach out to us on support, either by email, phoning, or using the case portal. Alternatively, you can reach out to your account manager. Now, we do have recordings and videos online, and you can see the URL for that. So if you do want to have a look at any of those, please feel free to. And we do also have our webinar recordings on our website. If you go to the URL of workbooks.com/resources, you'll have the option there to go view them. But thank you for attending, and I look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.